The GFX100s is such an incredible camera that I couldn't resist but to make a second review. The GFX100 shoots 100 megapixels, is a 16-bit camera, and has IBIS, all in one small form factor body that can easily handle street photography as well as studio. FujiFilm North America was awesome enough to send me the GFX100s along with the 80mm 1.7 and the 100-200mm 5.6 lenses to test out. The 80mm 1.7 came out earlier this year in 2021 and is the fastest lens in the GFX lineup with a 1.7 aperture. The 100-200mm lens is the widest zoom range on the GFX system. My personal favorite focal length is about 200mm, so I'm pretty excited to see how this lens performs. For this review, we're going to focus on the GFX100s, and I'm going to show you some long exposure photography, some car light painting examples, studio headshots, and of course, New York City street photography. We'll also talk about the pros and cons for each of these lenses, but mainly focus on the killer detail of these 100 megapixel images. I'll also show a few comparisons between the 80 and the 110mm lenses. Last time Fuji sent me some gear, I tested out the 110, and we'll do a bit of a battle of the bokeh, if you will. I'll have another video coming out talking specifically about these two lenses and my experience with them over these 3 weeks as well in the future. So let me know if you have any questions or comments below. I love having conversations with you guys, so please feel free to ask anything. If you enjoy these videos, definitely consider subscribing. I'm gonna continue reviewing more equipment. Another idea I had was potentially bringing you guys through a photo shoot from start to finish with the setup and the lighting to editing the files. Let me know if you'd be interested in watching that video. And with that, let's get into the review. So in my last review of the GFX100s, I showed many examples of street photography in various areas around New York City and some studio shots as well. In this review, we'll primarily focus on long exposure shots to see how this camera performs. First, we travel to Dumbo, which is on the top west area of Brooklyn, New York. This was my first night testing out the long exposure on this camera, and it also happened to be the day before September 11th, so you will see the memorial lights. I started out on the promenade, I took a few shots there, and then I ended up moving down towards the waterfront. I found this to be a better view. For the majority of the shots you'll see throughout this entire video, I'm using the 80mm 1.7. One kind of unpleasant surprise with this camera that I found out pretty quick in doing a multi-second exposure is the processing time. I've never experienced this on any camera before, but as you'll see, if I took a 25-second exposure, the photo would need to process for the same amount of time. So, for example, if you took a 10-second exposure shot, right after it finishes, the camera will need to process for another 10 seconds before you can do anything or take another picture. This is the same with 25 seconds, 40 seconds, a minute, etc. It's a bit disappointing, but hey, this is medium format. We're talking about quality, not speed. Since the 80mm is quite narrow, I was really only left with one option, a multi-shot pano. To achieve this, first I compose my framing with just holding the camera, and once I have the composition I like, I set up the tripod. Once set, then I do a horizontal pan just to make sure the scene is level and of course that it will still work nice in a pano. For this shot specifically, I took 4 shots in a row to mainly do the water and the buildings, and then I adjusted the camera up a bit to do another 4 shots to make sure I had enough of sky. I take each shot manually to make sure that there is no mistake with autofocus, and the most important thing you could do after each shot is taken is to check the focus, as it'll basically be impossible to line up the shot perfectly if you move the camera and check the photos after you're done taking all of the shots you need. As you'll see throughout each scene I take you through, there really is a lot of waiting around. It does add a ton of time with the processing, let alone doing, a multi-shot pano with each exposure being around 30 seconds. But as you can see, the results are absolutely insane. Let's open up this final JPEG in Photoshop and pixel peep a bit. So we have this image open in Photoshop. This is just the JPEG. And let's take a look at the camera specs. So like I mentioned, this was 8 shots merged into one pano. Each shot was a 25-second exposure at f9 using the 80mm, like I mentioned. So for this pano specifically, and no other panos we're going to talk about throughout the rest of the video, I stitched this together in a program called PT GUI. And the reason for this is that Lightroom just was not liking the sky. It would not merge all the photos together. And I also don't think it's about resolution, because the next pano, one of the next panos we're going to look at was 9 photos stitched together. So I'm a bit perplexed, but either way, my workflow for this pano was a little bit different, and I think it caused a bit of degradation in the final file. It's still massive, it still looks great, but we're not gonna hardcore pixel peep this. So yeah, I mean, overall this looks pretty insane. If we zoom in, we can really get a very large punch in. I don't have my navigator open. It doesn't really say the size that you're zoomed in, but I mean, the detail here is pretty insane and it's very sharp. If we zoom in on the memorial lights, you'll see light marks from the birds that flew into said light. But yeah, I think the quality here is pretty insane. If we zoom in on the bridge, this is super impressive. I mean, you can basically see every single wire on the bridge. You know, you have a pretty extreme level of clarity in the dynamic range and the shadows and the highlights. I am pretty new to doing long exposure shots, so I can't really speak to nailing things like the highlights and whatnot. Like, this is obviously a bit blown out, and so are these areas. And some other panels we're going to look at, it's not as bad. But like a building like this, for example, this is literally all lights. So, you know, it's literally every area of it is made up of lights. So I don't know if it would be possible to get that properly exposed. Perhaps I'd have to take like a just a single shot and merge that. Also, one other note with this edit specifically, I really wasn't able to kind of balance the midtones as much as I wanted to. Basically, when you do your stitching in PT GUI and you import that into Lightroom, it will not load the camera profiles, or the camera and the lens profiles rather, and you basically cannot apply, you know, the Fuji color profiles and whatnot. So it felt a little bit weird editing this because I didn't really have like my usual full control. But yeah, I think for all the others, it's not the case. But also, one last note, this the screen that I was recording, doing this screen capture on, is not 4K, so it is going to be upscaled. But that's also just a testament to the quality. It is a bit better than what you're looking at, but it's also not too bad. So yeah, let's take a look at the next one. So next, we walked across the Brooklyn Bridge and made our way over to an area in Manhattan by South Street Seaport, which is called Two Bridges. This is an area in which you are between the two bridges, the Manhattan and the Brooklyn Bridge. So for this shot, it wasn't as tall as the last one, so I was able to just take one row of panos and stitch them together afterwards. And basically, I've wanted to do long exposures for some time, especially after the last time I tested out this camera. And in thinking about it, just my biggest fear was the uneven sky when stitching them together. Because, you know, as you know, clouds move really fast, the sky can change as well due to atmosphere and whatnot. So I found that, like I kind of got into before, Lightroom really doesn't do a great job when stitching together the sky, but it really does do a great job with buildings and structures and whatnot. Even with the water, it doesn't do the best job. So just something to consider if you wanted to try this out. I would consider trying out a program like PT-GUI because there was really minimal issues with the last panel. So I have this one open in Photoshop as well. Each shot was about 25-second exposure. This aperture was at 5.6. Basically, yeah, the preview, I took a few more extra shots than I showed the final file as, just because I wasn't sure where I wanted to end the panel on the right side. But yeah, if we zoom in, same sort of quality as the last one, naturally. The detail in this camera is pretty insane. Like I was mentioning, for this panel, I had to revise the sky a decent amount because it just simply, Lightroom didn't stitch it well. But yeah, pretty insane. This image is basically at 240 resolution. This image is about 15 feet wide and 15 feet by 4. So that's pretty insane. I think one day I have to really test out printing these super massive. But yeah, even if we zoom in on like other parts of the image that were pretty secondary, grains are decently sharp. And we're zoomed in pretty far at this point, pretty far beyond like what's reasonable. So from where we were in the last location, I just walked along the waterfront a bit further down and snapped this picture. I thought the welcome sign was pretty cool. So yeah, with this one open in Photoshop, we can just zoom in, take a look at the detail. This isn't a bracketed shot, it's just one shot, not a panel as well. But yeah, you can see the welcome sign, despite being extremely bright. We basically have all the detail there. And yeah, we zoom in, the building is super sharp. I think the craziest thing, my craziest find in zooming in on all 100 megapixels is probably if we zoom in on this this corner of this building. Looks like there's some person just hanging out in the top of the building with their arms. But yeah, pretty neat. The panel for the 9/11 shot right here where this guy was standing. That's pretty funny. I think the neat thing about this camera is the dynamic range. So you have dark and light parts of this image, right? So over here is clearly a very light area, and then as you move over here, more residential, not as much going on. It's clearly a darker point in the image. But if we zoom in, the quality is still pretty, the dynamic range really is handled very well with this camera. You know, it's a little bit sharper on the lighter side, but overall, very impressive. Another night we headed to Roosevelt Island, a narrow island between the upper side of Manhattan and Astoria, Queens. To get here, you can take the F train right onto the island, or you can take the Roosevelt Island tram, which is a much more fun option, so we did that. It's always really cool seeing Manhattan from high up, and when you take this route, you get some really cool vanishing point shots. My main reason to go here was to take a photo from the park at the bottom of the island. You get a really nice view looking down Manhattan, but surprise, the park apparently closes at 7 p.m. and we got there too late. But it's okay, the island still has a bunch of great views to capture, and after getting off the train, the first spot we found was right under the Ed Koch Queensboro Bridge. And if you guessed that shot would be a pano, you would also be correct. I was able to pull off this shot with just two photos, a top and a bottom, and I found that gives a pretty neat perspective. For my X series, I have the 8 to 16mm lens, and I would really love to have an ultra wide lens for the GFX. I definitely think that this is a neat shot that I'm about to show you, but if it had substantially more to the left and the right, that'd be pretty interesting. I think also for pretty much the majority of the shots here, I could have avoided doing a crazy amount of panoing if I had a wider lens. So for this shot, we just did a 15-second exposure at f5.6. I really liked seeing all the detail in the bridge. And for shooting at just 5.6, literally the whole image from top to bottom is insanely sharp. Like, you know, you get things like trees and stuff that move in the wind. They're obviously going to be have some motion blur to them, but it's just insanely impressive how literally the entire image is sharp. This is definitely a medium format thing, and probably one of the biggest reasons to get a medium format camera for that specific look. Also, if we zoom in on the buildings, this clearly wasn't the focal point, the main focus, but the building is super sharp. Even the building all the way in the back, pretty sharp. A little soft, but also in doing long exposure, I think it makes elements like the water be much more smooth and pleasing, but you also get some like hidden light trails in the back that you wouldn't necessarily see for the first thing that you look at the image, because there's really not a visible highway. Well, there is, but you can't really see any cars because we did a 15-second exposure. Also, if we zoom in, we can see the tram lines are super crisp. See some cameras in the bridge. What's really cool and also really challenging at the same time is long exposure shots. They make everything really bright. Like this almost looks like a daytime shot. And the challenge is picking which elements to, you know, keep dark, which elements to adjust. That was a big learning curve for me in doing all this long exposure. So after the bridge shot, we made our way towards the park, which we found to be closed. And in walking towards the Queens side of the island, we passed the Smallpox Memorial Hospital, which was a hospital to treat people with smallpox. It closed in 1950 and is currently abandoned in a pretty dilapidated state. I wanted to take a shot through the fence, but I really didn't have a wide enough lens, so we kept on moving. Once we got to the Queens side, we basically ended up shooting towards Long Island City, which features a massive Pepsi sign. I think it's something like 49 feet tall by 150 feet wide or something along those lines. So like the shot with the two bridges, I shot this in portrait orientation. I was able to accomplish this shot with about 3 photos. So yeah, with this 3-shot pano, each shot was a 50-second exposure. I wanted to fool around with doubling the exposure pretty much and seeing what sort of effect we would get. So the water is definitely smoother than like a 15 or 25 shot pano. I think it's a bit more pleasing of a look, but it does come with a bit of a challenge because this was shot right by the water, so it was a little bit more breezy. I did have to retake, I think, 2 of these panos due to just a soft image. But yeah, if we zoom in, we could see that the image is very sharp. Kind of like, if you zoom in like here, it's kind of like overwhelming. Overwhelmingly sharp with detail. But yeah, if we zoom in on this massive neon Pepsi sign, we could see that all the quality is there. It's not completely blown out. And I think if I edited this slightly different, you'd even have even more quality, even more detail rather. But I think my favorite spot in this image would be this section here. Just kind of, it's not what you see when you notice it, but then when you do notice it, it's pretty neat. I also think you have, like, this is for an area of the image where it's not a main part. I think this is substantially farther back. I mean, this is pretty sharp. Yeah, I think this is f11. So, you know, we got edge to edge sharpness at f5.6. So I'm not really surprised that when at f11, it's even sharper. But I think also one of the biggest challenges for doing long exposure is nailing the, like I was kind of saying in the first shot, nailing the color balance. So when you do these long exposures, the midtones tend to be very yellow. So it's definitely a fine balance of bringing those down and properly color grading. But I'm pretty happy with this shot. We didn't have to go too far to get the next shot. There was a pretty nice view of the Ed Koch Queensboro Bridge, pretty much exactly where the tripod was already set up. But yeah, I would love to come back here with a wider lens. There's tons of great spots, and basically the bottom, like middle of the island is really a grassy area, and there's a pretty great juxtaposition between the skyscrapers and the grassy hill if you compose it properly. I just didn't really feel like doing another pano. For the most part, this night was pretty calm. It wasn't too windy. And like I mentioned earlier, it's just extremely crucial when doing long exposures that you check each image after the shot is complete, zooming in as far as you can in the camera preview, just to make sure that the camera wasn't moved by the wind or anything. So with this next shot of the bridge, this is a prime example of one of the best effects you get from doing long exposure photography. You just get this hyper illuminated effect that is kind of unlifelike, but really nice. So I really got to start moving through this, otherwise it's going to be a 30-minute video. But as you can see, this is another 50-second exposure. I think this was just a one and done shot, and basically it's really sharp, as you'd expect. You get a really nice level of dynamic range in the shadows and highlights and all that. And I really like the light trail that you can follow from the cars that goes the full length of the bridge. I thought that was pretty neat. Outside the studio, I'm more of a run and gun photographer. I very rarely bring around a tripod, and this is kind of why I wanted to focus on long exposure for the review, to kind of challenge myself to do something new. I also really like the pain of a heavy bag. But seriously, coming from the X series where I would carry around 3 lenses and never really feel like my bag was heavy, my bag was really heavy during these shoots. I had the GFX, the 80, the 100-200, tripod, bottle of water. My bag was really heavy, and I really am not one to complain about the weight. So anyway, I wanted to do some daytime long exposure, and in order to do this, I needed to pick up an ND filter. So I grabbed a 10 stop, I headed to Times Square, and I wasn't really sure what I wanted to capture here, but I heard they had a Ferris wheel, so I just kind of made my way towards that. I set up my tripod, I took a few shots, and as you'll see, my edit here was a bit more stylized than most of the other photos I'm showing you here. The scene was kind of a bit boring and flat, so I wanted to make it a bit more interesting. So cruising along with this, both these shots were 15-second exposures at f16, and this was with the 10-stop ND. It's just super bright during the day. And one of the coolest things, like I've been talking about how, you know, the wind can move your tripod and all that and doing long exposures, but so if we zoom in, I mean, this is super sharp. And what's really fascinating is that, you know, this structure is holding up this giant wheel that's turning, but clearly it doesn't move much because it's super sharp. But yeah, I really thought the effect of the Ferris wheel moving was really cool. I really don't see too much daytime long exposure. It's not as interesting for the most part, but I thought this was a pretty cool effect. And if we zoom in on the buildings in the back, naturally, they are super sharp. If we go to the second photo, same sort of thing. This outer rim, actually it looks like crazy sharp over here. but building's really sharp in the back. You get this really wild effect here. I thought that this was a pretty neat shot. I wish I definitely had a wider lens for this. I would have loved to get more of the Ferris wheel in, but I also don't mind this crop. So I used to take the J train every day to my office when I lived in Bushwick, and without a doubt it was my favorite train to ride in New York City due to it being above ground. It's just really cool to see the Manhattan skyline when you're headed into the city, and of course Brooklyn in the opposite direction. So the first stop in Brooklyn is Myrtle Ave, and it has a pretty sweet view, as you can see here. But this shot was super tricky and honestly a pretty lucky shot. The platform is raised up in the air, so it was really shaky, and after about 3 shots I almost gave up, but I gave it one more shot and the platform surprisingly kind of stayed still, and I ended up nailing a 15-second exposure. This is definitely one of my shots from the 3 weeks with this camera. It's just absolutely crazy how vibrant this camera can handle color. I think the 16-bit aspect of this camera is absolutely amazing. So again, this was a 15-second exposure, and if we zoom in, we could see some pretty substantial detail. Even further back, I think there definitely was a bit of, atmosphere distortion due to this being like a highway. So the bridge is a little soft and whatnot, but I think things like this building, which is right in front, pretty sharp. Also the tracks, you get some really nice color reflections in these tracks. And I think probably my favorite thing about this image is you just have a wide array of colors. You have lighting on this building that's different. You have lighting on the bridge is different. This building completely in shadows. Some oddness reflected in this window. Then you have these tracks over here, kind of a different temperature than over here. This is a completely different color vibe as well. I really enjoy this shot for all the uniqueness that it has. And also pretty sharp for being on top of a subway platform. On our way to the next destination, I wanted to take a shot of the Williamsburg Bridge from the street level. After we exited the platform, it was a pretty quick walk to the intersection of Bedford Ave and Broadway. Ironically, this ended up being a bit of a frustrating shot as well. That makes it 2 in a row. So for this one, I had to time the traffic light and do a max of 15-second exposure, otherwise the shot would get ruined by light trails. I don't mind some light trails, especially going down the street, but the issue is that the cars would turn from Broadway and the result wasn't very great. But nevertheless, we got the shot and it ended up being pretty cool. I had a grand vision of getting this shot at sunset, but timing wise it didn't end up working out this day. Also, I forgot to mention, I ended up using the 100-200mm lens for this shot. This was the first panel I used that lens for, and I pretty much was almost zoomed in at 200mm. I think I was at 180 for this shot. So since this is the first shot that we didn't use the 80 for, let's take a look at what we got. So this is a little bit cropped. I don't think it's too heavily cropped. As you can see, there's definitely you don't get the same edge-to-edge sharpness due to being at almost more than double the focal length. You definitely have a bit softer look on the cars, which of course is cool. Don't mind that. But yeah, you got some light trails in the back, and the bridge is pretty sharp. As sharp as we'd expect. Again, there's traffic going over the bridge, so emissions and temperature change may give it a bit of a soft look, but pretty sharp overall. You can obviously see every single cable on the bridge, also right up to the top. So this lens checks out as well. We are at the final destination of that night, and also we are at the end of the featured examples that I'm going to show. So We are at Domino Park, and this park used to house the Domino Sugar Refinery, hence the name. This park's at the edge of Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and in my opinion, it's one of the coolest parks in Brooklyn. It's super modern, it has really amazing views of many bridges, and of course, has the New York City skyline. So tonight, we were racing the rain the entire time. We hit 2 out of the 3 stops without any issues, but as soon as I set up my tripod here, it started to lightly rain. Fuji's weather sealing is truly amazing, so I wasn't too worried about some light rain. I did shoot a Lamborghini in a blizzard with my XH1, but after I got this shot, it really started to heavily rain, so we had to pack it up. I was able to get one pano and then wait for the rain to stop a bit, and I went around shooting a bit more, but ultimately we did get rained out, but we did get enough shots to really call it a successful night. So for this shot, we ended up going with a 30-second exposure shot at f/16. And basically, if we zoom in, we can see that everything's pretty sharp. As you can see, it was really foggy. So it's still pretty cool to see you get a decent level of detail even with the fog present. But yeah, as we'd expect, the bridge is pretty much edge to edge sharp. Even the building in the background, decently sharp for how foggy it is. This is also using the 80mm. So, pretty cool. Yeah, some of these buildings, they just got completely demolished by the fog, which is a really cool effect. And you can see some of the, like the light reflections in the fog. Water's pretty smooth. This is only a 2-shot pano. And yeah, even the bridge is in the background. So in the front you have the Williamsburg Bridge, then you have the Manhattan Bridge right here, and then you have the Brooklyn Bridge all over here. All the way in the back. This is pretty cool, 3 bridges in one shot. And that wraps up the featured examples. As these additional shots cycle through, I just wanted to discuss the lenses. So for the majority of the content in this video, as well as throughout the duration that I had the gear, I pretty much only used the 80mm. The 80 was just easier to travel with and lighter, but it also was a superior lens. I found the 80 to be substantially sharper, which isn't a surprise as it is a prime. Unlike the 110mm though, this lens does have a decent amount of chromatic aberration, which for the most part, it was only really noticeable when zooming in, a very large amount, so I wouldn't really say that it was a deal breaker. This lens is decently small, insanely sharp, and has amazing bokeh. I only had about 3 weeks experience with the 110mm back in the spring. I'd really need to have both at the same time and do a bit of comparisons to truly pick a winner. One thing that could be a deal breaker for the 80mm would be the speed. This is a really slow lens. The motor in this lens is definitely much slower than the 110, and the 110 is pretty slow to begin with. The motor is also pretty loud. So if you want a fast focusing lens in this sort of focal range, I would highly recommend the 120mm. I found this lens to be insanely sharp and extremely fast. I used this lens to photograph my dogs in the last review I did, and this lens is an f4, so it's not really a fair comparison. But if you aren't concerned with speed or noise, I was very pleasantly surprised with the 80, and I would absolutely recommend it. Next up, for the 100-200mm, I didn't end up using this lens as much as I thought I would. As an aperture of 5.6, the background separation naturally isn't as extreme as the 1.7. It was definitely refreshing to have the ability to zoom on medium format. This was really my first experience with a zoom lens on the GFX system, and I didn't hate this lens at all. My main complaint is that I felt 100mm of zoom range wasn't really enough. I would almost want a true equivalent to 70-200mm at 2.8 to consider buying this lens for myself. The only other obvious negative for this lens is that it's extremely large. Especially with the lens hood on, it is massive and not discreet at all. I wouldn't really feel extremely comfortable walking around with this lens all the time. The 80 or the 110mm lenses are pretty small and much more discreet. if you can get away with just using a prime. Otherwise, this lens is decently sharp. Not as sharp as the primes I've been talking about, but it's also at a much lower price point and it gets the job done. It also stands up to the GFX quality. So that about wraps up the video. As you may have guessed, I recorded the intro before I sent back all the gear, and of course edited the photos and scripted out this video. So after doing that, it kind of made more sense to focus on long exposure for this video since I had so much to talk about, and kind of make a part 2 of this video where I go more in depth on the other types of photos I took. So stay tuned for a part 2 of the part 2, hopefully coming next month, in November, maybe early December. For that video, I will have some non-long exposure street photography, some studio headshots, and some light painting, which would be pretty cool. If you've made it this far, thanks for following along. Let me know if you have any comments or questions below. I'd also love to hear what was your favorite photo or scene from this video. For the future, I'm hoping to get my hands on a 23mm, 45mm for the GF system, and also maybe a 50S Mark II, and make a review video on that. Or if you have any other types of lenses that you'd like me to get on the GF system, let me know. Lastly, I just want to thank FujiFilm North America for sending me this gear to test out for a couple weeks. Shout out to Dan. Also, big shout out to Dom for helping me out with this audio situation. I hope this audio sounds a bit clearer. And with that, I'll catch you in the next video.